We suffer more in imagination than in reality. Seneca wrote that almost 2,000 years ago, and that should have fixed this problem for everyone who heard it. But clearly it hasn't, even though it's so obviously true. Unfortunately, the part of our brain that generates suffering doesn't read philosophy. Instead, it just runs scenarios over and over and over again. And by now, you're probably exhausted by it. You're tired of always rehearsing all of these disasters that mostly never arrive. So now let's get into the brain's threat simulation system and why it does this. Because catastrophizing isn't random. It's the output of a system that was designed through evolutionary selection pressure to keep you alive by modeling threats before they appear. Because the brain that could simulate a predator's behavior before the predator arrived was the brain that survived long enough to pass on its genes. It's the feature that kept human beings alive. Unfortunately, this feature is now the problem because the system doesn't distinguish between the predator that's about to appear that requires immediate fight or flight mobilization and your performance review that's a few weeks away. Your threat detection and threat simulation systems treat both of those two scenarios with the same activation and both create the same stress hormones. And Daniel Kahneman's framework of systems 1 and 2 thinking is helpful here, where system 1 is fast, automatic, and operating below conscious awareness. Meanwhile, system 2 is slow, deliberate, and requires effort. The catastrophizing happens in system 1. And if you try to tell yourself intellectually that the performance review will likely be fine, or the thing you're dreading about is not likely to go as bad as you're imagining it, but your System 2 already knows this and believes it. But System 1 continues running the disaster scenario anyway because System 1 isn't checking with System 2 before it creates an emotional response. And there is a difference between real problems and the scenarios you make up in your head at 2 in the morning. And it's that those scenarios are not constrained by reality. Reality is bounded by what's actually occurring, but the scenarios are bounded only to your imagination, which has no limit and will normally default towards worst case rather than most likely. And these are the effects of this. First is your cognitive depletion. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for executive function, decision making, and planning, consumes resources to process the simulated scenarios in the same way it would consume resources to process real situations. So the brain doesn't create a stress response for imagined threats and then save the cognitive processing for the real ones. Instead, it uses real cognitive resources on the imaginary problems too, which means by the time a real problem arrives, someone who's already spent 3 hours catastrophizing about it has less cognitive capacity available to deal with it than they would have if they didn't run the simulation at all in the first place. Which is the irony of the whole thing. Catastrophizing presents itself as preparation, but it produces the opposite of readiness. It produces an already stressed cognitive system that is less capable of handling the situation than it would have been without all of that preparation. The second thing is your sleep disruption. The activated nervous system makes sleep harder to achieve, and the reduced sleep reduces your cognitive and emotional regulation capacity. So the reduced capacity makes the catastrophizing more severe the next night, and the severity of the catastrophizing makes sleeping harder again. So the cycle is self-reinforcing in a way that can continue to persist without change. The third thing is decision paralysis. When your mind is running multiple disaster worst case scenarios simultaneously, it creates a paralysis around action. Every potential decision has its catastrophic version modeled by the simulation engine. And when enough of these versions are active at once, the cognitive cost of picking any action feels so high, so then you don't choose anything because the path of least resistance is to do nothing. And then the fourth and last thing is the physical manifestations. The stress hormones that this creates, including cortisol and adrenaline, have physical effects aside from just the cognitive effects, such as the tension in your muscles or having an elevated heart rate, because your body is in a state of mobilization for a threat that isn't even physically present and is busy burning through resources and building stress from an imaginary emergency. And also, catastrophizing isn't only one thing, there's different forms of it. There's the pre-mortem spiral, where you're about to do something, but then your brain immediately starts running failure scenarios. First, the presentation fails. So then the project fails. So then your reputation fails. So then your position fails. This runs several steps further than it should into increasingly more consequences, all of which feel equally possible from inside the spiraling. Also is the relationship version, where someone you care about hasn't responded to a message, or they responded with a short message, so now the simulation begins. You start thinking that they're angry with you, or maybe they're pulling away. You start replaying the last interaction you had with them in your head, looking for the cause, and you think you solved it because the simulation can work backwards from a conclusion and then falsely construct evidence for it. And there's also the health version, where a physical symptom appears and it can be something very minor, something that could easily be nothing. But then the simulation already thinks it has a diagnosis, and it won't be the most probable explanation. It will be the most alarming explanation, and once the alarming diagnosis is in the simulation, everything else becomes evidence for it. But in all of these, what do they all have in common? And that is the gap between the trigger, which is normally something small, and the scenario, which is normally something enormous. So these small triggers are enough to activate worst case scenarios because the scenarios go wherever your anxiety tells it to. And intelligence sometimes makes this worse. The more capable your brain is of modeling complex future scenarios, then the more material it has to work with when your anxiety is running the simulation. A person with a more vivid imagination and more sophisticated modeling capabilities will create more elaborate scenarios. This is part of the reason why more intelligent people are not less anxious than less intelligent people, because some of those capacities and capabilities are more useful in other contexts, but are worse in the catastrophizing context. And this is also why the rational reassurance approach, like someone telling you, or you trying to tell yourself that the situation is fine, doesn't work. And that's because the simulation is smart enough to block your simple reassurance. It has already anticipated that and built a way around it into the model. Like, of course, that's what you tell yourself in this situation. But when Seneca wrote this, he was making a philosophical claim about the relationship between consciousness and suffering. The Stoic framework that Seneca was working within makes the distinction between what is in your control and what is not. External events, such as other people's opinions and outcomes and circumstances, are largely not within your control, but your judgment of these events and your response to them and the meaning you place with them are within your control. So the catastrophizing scenario, in Stoic terms, is a double error. First, it is treating an imagined future event as if it were present reality, which means suffering the consequences of something that has not happened or may not occur. And second, it is treating an external event like a feared outcome, as if the occurrence would necessarily be the catastrophe that the simulation is predicting, which is an error about the relationship between external events and suffering. The Stoic insight is that almost nothing that happens to you is as devastating in reality as it is in the simulation. Marcus Aurelius had a similar practice to all of this, which was whenever he was disturbed by something, he would ask whether the disturbance was about something happening or about his judgment about what was happening or might happen. He would ask whether the thing that might happen was as bad as his judgment suggested, or whether his judgment was the source of his suffering rather than the circumstance. So now for the answer. What can we do to help try to stop this? First is to physically return to the present moment. The catastrophizing mind is, by definition, in the future. By physically returning attention to the present, it interrupts the simulation by changing your attention. This looks like the simple act of noticing 5 things that you can see, or noticing the physical sensations of your breathing. The simulation can't run fully while your attention is grounded in the present sensory experience. Second is the probability question. I'm not referring to asking, could this go wrong? Because the answer to that is always yes. I am referring to asking, what is the most likely outcome based on the evidence available to me right now? By deliberately and explicitly asking about the most likely case, it forces your reasoning system to engage with the base rates instead of with the elaborated worst case scenarios. The third thing you could do is to try the writing it down interruption. By writing something down, it forces a linearity that the internal simulation doesn't have, because internal catastrophizing can run in multiple directions simultaneously and can be vague in ways that make it feel larger than it is. But written down, it becomes a specific thing with identifiable components. And lastly is the time-bounded worry window. This is about setting a certain limited period to engage with the catastrophic scenario, which could be 5 minutes, 15, 30, or however long you choose. And what you do is actually engage with the scenario fully instead of trying to suppress it. And then when that period is over, you redirect it to something else. The suppression approach, which is trying to not think about the thing, doesn't work because the suppression requires continuous cognitive effort. And once you stop trying, the thing that was being suppressed comes back. But the time-bounded approach doesn't suppress it, it contains it. And lastly here, I want to point out specifically nighttime catastrophizing, because it is way worse than daytime catastrophizing because of sleep deprivation, reduces your capacity for rational thoughts, and increases your emotional reactivity to your amygdala. Your brain at 2 a.m. is more anxious than it is at 2 p.m. And the isolation of nighttime is also key, because during the day, your life is continuously interrupting the catastrophizing simulations. But at 2 a.m., there is nothing to interrupt it. So, in the end, Seneca was right. We suffer more in imagination than in reality.